Hey everybody, welcome back to the Court of Random Opinion. My name is Lauren Neidigh. Last week I made a video discussing the case of Nick Reiner, who's accused of murdering his parents, Rob and Michele Reiner. We talked broadly about some issues surrounding substance abuse and schizophrenia and how psychiatric hospitalizations work and when they're appropriate. But today I want to talk about a different issue that's come up in this case, so I'll link to that previous video in the comments if you want to see it. I've seen a lot of headlines and people commenting online about an insanity defense. And so this is something that's very rarely successful and might not be appropriate here. Schizophrenia doesn't automatically take away responsibility from someone's actions. Even if there are medication side effects, it doesn't mean someone is incapable of stopping themselves from being violent. Drug use and intoxication is also not an acceptable basis for an insanity defense, so that's going to come into play. And the schizophrenia diagnosis itself can be challenged because a lot of people are misdiagnosed. I spent years working with and evaluating emergency psych patients, and a lot of them were brought to the emergency room or the psychiatric crisis units I worked on from the jail as they were pending trial. There were doctors in the emergency room that would consult me to help them determine if someone needed to be placed involuntarily on a psych unit or whether or not they could be discharged to the community for a lower level of care. Just for transparency, I have my master's in criminology with a bachelor's degree in psych, and then I did some additional grad school education in forensic psych. So I spent a lot of time studying some of the topics you guys might see coming up in the headlines about this case. I talked more about my background in the last video. Like I said, you can watch that at the link in the comments if you want, but I'm not a doctor and I'm not a lawyer, so please do not take this as medical or legal advice. The family has asked for compassion, and I intend to honor that, so I'll avoid talking specifically about Nick's family relationships if possible. Whether or not Nick meets the burden for an insanity defense or not doesn't make it less of a tragedy for the family, and I want to be sure to remember that when we talk about this stuff. I firmly believe that we have a huge mental health and substance abuse crisis in this country and that our systems are failing a lot of people in a big way. I think substance abuse intersects with mental illness in a way that makes treatment very difficult. I do believe we need to make major changes in the accessibility and availability of treatment because that can help prevent tragedies and violence. It can help stop people from spiraling down a path that leads to that. But people responsible for tragedies still have to be held responsible. Avoiding accountability for crimes due to a mental health diagnosis or substance addiction is not the answer. When it comes to an insanity defense, the law is going to consider someone's mental capacity, not so much their specific diagnosis. So the insanity plea in simple terms means that someone was so mentally impaired at the time of the crime that they couldn't understand what they were doing or that it was wrong. You can experience delusions, thought disorganization, hallucinations, mania, etc., and still know that what you're doing is wrong. Let's take hallucinations as an example, since this is a symptom people commonly think of when they hear schizophrenia. Even if someone's hearing voices telling them to harm or kill people, that person can still understand that killing people is illegal. They still know that violence is causing harm to another person, so while they're very sick and suffering from their symptoms, they still have the ability to determine that their actions are wrong. This is just one way to look at whether or not someone had the capacity to understand right and wrong, but any attempt to cover up or to avoid detection by law enforcement after a crime, that's something to be considered. So whatever Nick did between the murders and the arrest is likely going to be very relevant here. I can give you a couple of examples to demonstrate some of what I was just talking about. So Richard Chase, he was the serial killer called the Dracula Killer or the Vampire of Sacramento, I think it was. So I'll try to be somewhat brief because this is pretty gruesome, but I think it's important to look at extreme examples to understand how really horrific, violent things driven by psychosis don't necessarily meet the standard for an insanity defense. So Richard Chase murdered and mutilated people. He consumed their blood and their organs, and he had a delusional belief that he needed to consume other people's blood to replenish his own blood supply. He believed his own blood was turning to powder that was eating away at his own internal organs and that it was going to kill him. Even in this extreme, terrifying example, he didn't meet the standard for the insanity defense. He was found to be legally competent when he committed his crimes. So these bizarre delusions didn't prevent him from understanding that murder is wrong. He still knew that you can't just go around killing people and drinking their blood. It didn't mean he couldn't go to a doctor or a hospital to get help with the issue he believed he was having, but he killed people instead, and he knew that was illegal. Think about an even more well-known example is Son of Sam, David Berkowitz. Sometimes experts can call bullshit when a defendant is malingering or exaggerating in an attempt to downplay their responsibility or make it sound like their illness was more severe, or they paint themselves in a more sympathetic light. David Berkowitz claimed that a dog possessed by a demon, and I think it was his neighbor's dog actually, gave him orders to kill people. And psychiatrists for the defense had deemed him unfit to stand trial at one point, but an expert for the prosecution said, no, the dog story was a conscious fabrication. Ultimately, David Berkowitz withdrew his intended insanity plea and he instead decided to plead guilty. He also later admitted the dog story was made up. Even if there had been truth to it, he still knew killing was illegal and that his victims were real people he was causing harm to. He took steps to avoid the police. Like, you can say you believe the victim was a demon, but you still know you can't just go around killing people and then cover it up. But he made up the story about the dog to manipulate law enforcement and the media. Experts and officials have said they believe Berkowitz was a master manipulator who made up crazy stories to confuse people. And a lot of my job in the ER involved assessing whether or not someone was malingering, which means they were just deliberately faking symptoms. But if there's any interest in hearing more about that, then just let me know in the comments and I can do a separate video on that another time. Before we get back to talking about Nick's specific case, let's talk about one successful example of an insanity plea. So common factors in the rarely successful insanity defense are going to be active psychosis at the exact time of the crime, delusions that destroy your moral or factual understanding, and little or no effort to conceal the crimes or escape undetected. Now, this is not all that goes into it, but these are just common factors in the success stories, so to speak. The defendant's psychosis is going to have to completely eradicate their ability to understand reality or wrongfulness. So take Deanna Laney, and I believe this was in Texas. She killed 2 of her sons. She had acute psychosis with religious delusions. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury found that even though she understood she was killing her children, her delusions led her to believe that God required her to do this, so she believed it was not wrong. They found that at the time of the crime, her delusions wiped out her ability to understand wrongfulness. So with all of this and these examples in mind, remember that Nick Reiner's history is largely irrelevant to an insanity plea. That's why I don't want to focus too much on his past or the videos that have come out and his behavior from years ago in this particular video. What he has or hasn't done in the past or his history of mental health diagnoses is not really relevant to whether or not he had the capacity to understand that murdering his parents was wrong at the time he did it. Being hospitalized after the fact, even now, so if he were admitted to a psych hospital right now for psychosis, that doesn't really mean that he didn't understand what he was doing at the time. It's very much narrowed down to the moment of the crime. A total loss of insight is something that would be extremely difficult to prove. And now we also have to consider the issue of drug abuse. In the specific case of Nick Reiner, substance abuse and intoxication is obviously going to come up. Drug use and being high are not an acceptable basis for an insanity defense. Beyond that, in the court of public opinion, of course, people will question whether his actions were caused by drug use versus mental illness. He apparently has a long-standing drug abuse problem and has been to rehab multiple times. We have widespread reports of his previous schizophrenia diagnosis, and his medications had recently been changed, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, can have negative side effects and consequences. But if you put drugs in the mix, then you don't really know that the negative side effects of the medications for the schizophrenia would even be present without the drugs on board. Drugs will both eliminate positive effects of medications and also completely exacerbate negative side effects. So even if medications are causing negative side effects, it doesn't take away criminal responsibility. That's especially true if you're willingly using drugs that you know are going to cause a bad reaction when you mix them with your medications. And someone with a long-standing history of these things would certainly know that. Someone like Nick with a long-standing history of drug use already knows that doing these kinds of drugs in itself is illegal. He's been open about his history with meth and heroin use, for example. He knows the effects of these drugs and that what they have on him, and he knows his behavior while under the influence has consequences. So if he was using drugs at the time of the crimes, this is going to be an issue for him. Substance use is a voluntary act. I know that addiction is a disease, but the act of taking the substances is a voluntary external choice. So while we can have empathy for people who struggle with addiction, we can't allow it to eliminate criminal responsibility. We can't excuse violent crimes with drug use because the consequences of drug use are foreseeable and the person using the drugs is accepting the risk. This is another topic I have a lot of thoughts on, just based on my experience working in the hospital. But again, I'll work on that another day if you guys are interested. I think in a lot of cases, and I'm not speaking specifically to Nick here, just generally, I think a lot of people are misdiagnosed with schizophrenia when the actual underlying issue is recurrent and consistent substance abuse. I also think that sometimes people who do have mental health issues are not getting their needs met because their issues are written off as drug-related. It's a double-edged sword. So when it comes to an insanity defense, ultimately the conclusion that can be drawn is that you can be both mentally ill and guilty. It's extremely hard to be successful in using this defense, as it should be, in my opinion. That's all I got for today, but I am looking for suggestions on other cases or issues that I can look into that people might be interested in. So if you have any ideas, just let me know in the comments and let me know what you guys think about this insanity defense topic that's coming up. Thanks, and I'll see you all soon.